I'm Claude Shannon, a mathematician here at the Bell Telephone Laboratories.
He didn't create the compact disc, the fax machine, digital wireless telephones, or MP3 files. But in 1948, Claude Shannon paved the way for all of them with the basic theory underlying digital communications and storage. He called it information theory. And while Shannon did most of his pioneering work in the 1940s and 50s, the impact of his research on the real world is far more widespread today than it was 50 years ago.
The whole idea of digitizing things and the fact that you can save them, store them, you can download them, upload them, a lot of that, comes out of Shannon. Just that whole idea that digitization is useful not just because it sounds good, but because you can save it, you can store it on a CD or a DVD player, and the bits are the same today, they're the same today, they're the same tomorrow.
As historians look back on the 20th and the 21st century, they'll say that Shannon created a challenge for engineers in 1948, and within 50 or 60 years they'd solved this challenge and went on to other aspects of digital technology.
While information theory was his landmark work, Claude Shannon also contributed to the early development of integrated circuits, computers, cryptography, artificial intelligence, even genomics, making him one of the most influential minds of the 20th century. Yet when he died on February 24, 2001, Shannon was virtually unknown to the public at large. Elwyn Berlekamp, a UC Berkeley professor who co-wrote several papers with Shannon.
He was a rather, I would say, somewhat shy. Not withdrawn. I mean, you could. It took some. You had to make some effort to access him. But he certainly was not one to volunteer to get in the limelight.
The lay public does not fully appreciate how much of an impact information theory has made, coding and so on many of the things that we take for granted, from things, anything that involves storage, like CD players, for example, anything that involves communication of data, your modem that dials up and moves bits over the telephone channel, just about everything to do with communication, storage, and coding, compression, follow in some ways directly from the contributions that Shannon made.
His discoveries were very much like Einstein's, in the sense that Einstein was thinking about some things that no one else was, and suddenly came out with not just the question, but the answer, like the E equals mc squared, sort of. That initiated all the research in atomic energy, the fact that there is so much energy, and this is how much there is. Well, Shannon discovered these formulas about information transmission, how fast, how many bits per second you should be able to transmit over various media. And other people weren't asking the question, and he came out with this answer, and it was just so beautiful that it inspired the people who ended up designing your cell phone and the communication links that make up the internet.
Shannon, a lifelong lover of Dixieland music, popular when he was young, was born in 1916 and grew up in the small town of Gaylord, Michigan. His father, a probate judge, his mother, principal of the local high school. A distant relative of Thomas Edison, in college Shannon studied mathematics and electrical engineering at Ann Arbor, after a youth spent tinkering with radio sets, model planes, even building a telegraph system to a friend's house half a mile away. Graduating in 1936, Shannon went on to graduate school at an institution he would be associated with for most of his life, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Well, his master's thesis was on Boolean algebra, which is kind of an abstract field, but it's really the basis for the design of computer circuits.
Shannon wrote that pivotal thesis in 1938 at the age of 22, applying the two-value binary algebra and symbolic logic originally conceived by 19th century English mathematician George Boole to the on and off positions of switching circuits, envisioning them as the basis of what he called a logic machine.
He created the field of digital logic. Now, if you think about that, that sounds like a very simple thing to say now, but what does logic have to do with digital? Logic is reasoning correctly from premises. It's a subject in philosophy. He showed that and, or, and not, the simple connectives from theoretical Boolean algebra, could be used to build electronic circuits, which led in no small part to the invention of the computer. People have said it's the most influential master's thesis in history, which is certainly true, but it understates the point. If he'd done nothing else, he'd still be famous for inventing digital logic.
Shannon landed at MIT after answering an ad for someone to work on one of the earliest analog computers, MIT engineering dean Vannevar Bush's differential analyzer, a mechanical calculating machine. Shannon left MIT in 1940 to teach for a year at Princeton. He would later tell friends that during one of his lectures, Albert Einstein walked in, whispered to someone at the back of the class, and promptly left. Eagerly quizzing the student later on what was said, Shannon got a kick out of the answer. Einstein was asking where tea was being served. In 1941, Shannon stayed in New Jersey but moved into full-time research, joining Bell Telephone Laboratories. Shannon's arrival at Bell's research arm coincided with the Blitz over Britain. His early work included anti-aircraft devices that could calculate and target the aim of counter missiles against enemy planes or rockets, including the German V-1 and V-2 rockets that began raining down on England in 1942. Bell also put Shannon, now in his mid-20s, to work as a cryptographer. Some of the groundbreaking encryption work he did was built into the complex scrambling machine used by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to safeguard their wartime transatlantic conferences. Later in the 40s, Shannon would spell out the fundamentals of modern cryptography in a paper called Communication Theory of Secrecy Systems.
I worked in cryptography for about 15 years, more especially the last 5 years, and it always amazes me to go back and read some of his papers, how perceptive some of his comments actually were.
Ian Blake teaches at the University of Toronto and recalls a conversation with Horst Feistel, the IBM researcher who in the 1970s developed the most widely used data encryption standard in the world to this day.
He left me in no doubt whatsoever that he had read Shannon's paper and was very strongly influenced by the principles of confusion and diffusion that it contained. And the data encryption system served for a worldwide standard, in essence, for the last 25 years.
After the war, Shannon focused increasingly on how to apply binary values to telephone switching circuits.
Shannon was in a culture in the late 1940s where people did actually worry about the telephone network, of how to make a better telephone network. And, you know, I came along a little later than that, not a heck of a lot later, but, you know, a little later than that, you know. And people don't believe how it was almost religion with us that, you know, we were out to make the world's best telephone network and to make it better.
Shannon worked for the telephone company. So one of the first things that they figured out as a result of this is that you probably shouldn't just make a telephone line longer and longer and longer and put amplifiers in the middle of the line. Pretty soon the signal starts getting smaller. And so eventually you have to amplify it. You have to make it bigger again so that the signal can move the next stretch. But every time you amplified the signal, you amplified all the imperfections that got into the signal, which we call noise. And pretty soon, all you had was noise.
That led Shannon to a fundamental rethinking of the way telephone conversations and any other types of messages or information, as he called it, were transmitted. While others were thinking up better ways to send analog telegraph or telephone signals, Shannon conceived of digital communications.
In Shannon's case, what happened was, and it was a tremendous surprise, that there was sort of a common commodity associated with all kinds of information, whether it be radio or television or satellites, etc. And this common commodity was, first of all, information, and information could be represented in binary form or a sequence of bits.
The term bit, short for binary digit, first appeared in print in Shannon's groundbreaking 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. But in it, he gave credit for the term to a fellow Bell Labs researcher.
Very early in Shannon's famous paper, he attributes the coinage of the word bit to John Tukey. But the Tukey bit and the Shannon bit really aren't the same thing. The popular notion of a bit is simply a unit of storage that you store either a 0 or a 1, and that's a bit. Now, Tukey coined this as simply a contraction of binary digit. The Shannon bit is a unit of information, and a storage bit contains at most one bit of information, but quite often a lot less.
Shannon's world wasn't made of bits. You know, back in 1940s and stuff, the world was not an information world. Information technology was yet to be really conceived. The information age wasn't there. And you know, the idea of digitally representing things and working with bits just wasn't understood or there.
In research circles, the 1948 paper published in the Bell System Technical Journal made Shannon a star overnight. It revolutionized the way engineers and scientists thought about communications, galvanizing researchers and spawning a new school of thought called information theory. By 1949, when Shannon married Mary Elizabeth Moore, Betty for short, and a numerical analyst at Bell Labs, he was an academic celebrity. More than 40 years later, Scientific American and other publications would label Shannon's paper the Magna Carta of the information age.
It's one of the few times in history where somebody founded a field, stated all the major results, and proved most of them all pretty much at once.
Shannon saw the binary digit as the fundamental element in communication. Information could be boiled down to sequences of ones and zeros, encoded, sent, then decoded at the other end. Messages could then be transmitted over long distances with virtually no loss in quality. While Shannon's work was theoretical, it didn't take long for his employer to figure out how to use the theory.
What Bell came up with was a technology called a regenerative repeater. And what this said was, if instead of working with analog signals like my voice, if we had bits, if we didn't let the bits get too small, okay, we could regenerate the bit perfectly. And so instead of an amplifier, they put this device called the regenerative repeater, and then they started out with a bit, and a mile later they still had that same bit.
While laying the groundwork for information theory, Shannon also contributed one of the fundamental insights guiding researchers ever since.
One of the things that Shannon did, which I think he's very widely known for, is this notion of a fundamental limit. No matter what you do, as long as you're working with a certain amount of bandwidth, and as long as you're dealing with signals that are only so strong in the face of noise that you confront, no matter what you do, you cannot transmit more than a certain rate.
Today, that barrier is widely known as the Shannon limit or Shannon capacity.
In a sense, it was a prediction. It's like the speed of light. He said you can travel no faster than the speed of light, but he didn't say how to build rocket ships to do that. And so we've been trying since that time. When I say we, I mean the engineers, the mathematicians, the computer scientists who followed and who accepted the challenge that Shannon laid out, so to speak, have tried to find practical ways to get all the way up to channel capacity, to get more efficient wireless communications, fax modem communication.
That challenge took decades. Dave Forney, who studied under Shannon at MIT and now teaches there, went on to design the first computer modems for Motorola and also invent codes and algorithms that have become global standards for data transmission.
We are basically there. We're within a very small epsilon of the Shannon's channel capacity. But this really has only happened in the past decade and really only in the last 5 years in any kind of practical sense. So this is new news, that it really took 50 years for both the technology and the algorithms and the codes to get to the point where we could crack all of these problems.
In his 1948 paper, Shannon also provided the foundations of data compression decades before it would be widely used. He saw the need and formulated the theory on which billions of JPEG, MPEG, MP3, and zip files are transmitted daily over the Internet. Shannon also pointed followers in the right direction in their efforts to boost the efficiency of digital transmission or storage. He came up with the concept of adding extra so-called redundant bits to a message so that it could be reconstructed at the other end despite some corruption. That is why today you can take a knife and scratch a CD, but it will still play as new. because it contains enough extra bits to make up for any that are faulty. To build this type of redundancy into storage and transmission, Shannon's followers had to design sophisticated error detection and correction codes. Andrew Viterbi, the designer of coding algorithms now widely used in wireless phone networks and co-founder of Qualcomm, notes that it took years for technology to catch up with the digital future that Shannon foresaw.
Where we used to have one transistor per chip, we now have somewhere between 10 million and 100 million. All of that was necessary in order to make the Shannon theories practical. And it's quite interesting to note that Shannon's papers came out in 1948, and late in 1947 the transistor was invented in the same Bell Laboratory environment, Murray Hill, New Jersey, and the two went hand in hand.
As Viterbi recalls, the first testing ground for Shannon's theory was the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the dawn of the space age.
I, for one, was fortunate enough to land at the right place at the right time, that is JPL, just before Sputnik was launched, and therefore was on the ground floor, so to speak, of the space race, and was able to influence the coding systems that flew in the early and even some of the later spacecrafts, always essentially applying the lessons of Shannon ever more diligently, efficiently, or as we were learning more and more.
Solomon Ghulam, now at the University of Southern California, also worked at JPL in the 50s and 60s and was instrumental in making digital the new paradigm for deep space communications.
When I started talking in the late 50s at JPL about digital communications, this was considered a contradiction in terms by the traditional communication theorists. They were so wedded to the notion that communication involved continuous waveforms and continuous modulation. So the whole idea that communications could be, and we're moving in the direction of going digital, was a new idea that was very heavily influenced by Shannon. And the systems we started designing for deep space communication were, from that point of view, very much influenced by this whole new concept. The basic notion that Shannon contributed to communications, which was that you could compare how well you were doing with an underlying model that told you what was the limit, what was the capacity of your channel in a theoretical sense.
The same year he married Betty, 1949, Shannon branched out from information theory and built a rudimentary computer to play chess. A year later, he wrote a paper on programming the machines, including several strategies for computer chess algorithms still in use today. He was also an early pioneer in the field of artificial intelligence, how to teach a machine to learn.
This is thesis. Thesis is an electrically controlled mouse. He has the ability to solve a certain class of problems by trial and error means and then remember the solution. In other words, he can learn from experience.
It was named after the legendary Greek hero who escaped from a maze after slaying the Minotaur. Although he continued as a consultant there for another decade, Shannon left Bell Labs in 1956 to return to MIT to teach. While there, he engaged in an eclectic set of interests and inventions, many of them, in his own words, useless. In a 1963 edition of Vogue that also trumpeted the 60s as the pink decade in fashion, the magazine described some of Shannon's early contraptions, from a chairlift that took his kids 600 feet down from the house to Mystic Lake, to the hidden panel in his library that sprung open but didn't lead anywhere.
The fact is, he loved engineering things, you know, the gadgets that he kept around his house, the mechanical mouse, the chairlift from his house down to the lake. I mean, that was an integral part of his you know, psyche, his mentality.
He built more than 30 unicycles by hand in his garage. You know, one of his questions was that intrigued him was how small a unicycle could a human ride, and he had several that no one had ever ridden.
Shannon was an inveterate tinkerer and inventor. One room in his house was crammed with dozens of his devices: a computer that could calculate in Roman numerals, a machine that could solve the Rubik's Cube puzzle, a gasoline-powered pogo stick, and several mechanical juggling machines. Shannon himself took up juggling with a vengeance, a sport he later demonstrated for this Canadian broadcasting documentary. He also wrote a widely praised academic paper on the dynamics of keeping multiple objects in the air at the same time.
Generally, if a guy comes up with all those things, here's a mouse that does a maze and this and that, you know, I sort of think he's showing off that he's Mr. Idea Man. But he was so quiet and unassuming and humble that I think that he was doing these little things despite himself rather than to show off.
Stanford professor Thomas Cover won the Shannon Award in 1990, in part for his work extending information theory into investment analysis. Shannon never published on the subject, but delivered 2 influential lectures at MIT on stock investing, predating widespread use of portfolio theory on Wall Street. He and Betty Shannon also made a killing in the stock market after investing in technology startups owned by friends, companies such as Teledyne and Hewlett-Packard. Like playing the stock market, games and game theory also appealed to Shannon.
One of Shannon's connections that is little known was that Ed Thorpe, the guy who became famous for writing the book Beat the Dealer, how to play blackjack optimally and count the cards. Apparently, one summer he had gone out to, he talked to Shannon and he asked whether Shannon would submit his work on blackjack to the proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And Shannon got interested, and before long he ended up going out to Shannon's house and working on roulette prediction.
In 1973, on the 25th anniversary of Shannon's landmark paper, the Information Theory Society, within what is now called the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, instituted an annual Shannon lecture that evolved into the Shannon Award. UC Berkeley professor Elwin Berlekamp, a later recipient of that award, invited Shannon to deliver the first lecture.
I've never seen such a case of stage fright. Of course, once he got on stage, you know, and got after the first line or two, he did a fantastic job, and there was no problem.
He had been out of information theory for certainly 5 and maybe the better part of 10 years at that point, felt that there was little that he had any right to talk to this group of eminent people about.
He just felt that people were going to expect so much of him in this talk, and he was afraid that he didn't have anything significant to say. Needless to say, he gave a fantastic talk, but in my mind, it just showed me what a modest man he was.
Even after retiring from MIT in 1978, Shannon could never completely escape his fame within the engineering community.
Shannon is a hero of mine.
Caltech's Bob McLeese says it was as if Newton had showed up when Shannon attended a 1985 meeting in Brighton, England.
People lined up to get his autograph. Physicists don't line up to get other physicists' autographs, I don't think. I think he was just so far beyond of what the rest of us were capable of doing, there were photo opportunities.
Despite his fundamental achievements, Shannon never won a Nobel Prize.
He would have won it years ago, but his work is in mathematics and engineering. There is no Nobel Prize in mathematics and engineering. But in about 1980, the mid-80s, 84, 85, the Japanese government created a prize called the Kyoto Prize, which was supposed to be a mirror of the Nobel Prize. Monetarily, it's more money. Shannon won the first Kyoto Prize.
Shannon gave his last major interview to Omni magazine in 1987. By the late 1980s, Shannon made fewer appearances, and friends began noticing signs that he was grappling with a terrible condition, Alzheimer's. When the former Bell Labs buildings in Florham Park, New Jersey, were rechristened the AT&T Shannon Laboratories in 1998, Shannon was in a nursing home, too sick to attend. When his hometown of Gaylord, Michigan, put up a statue in his honor in October 2000, Shannon's wife Betty stood in for him. A few months later, in February 2001, at the age of 84, Shannon lost his long battle with Alzheimer's disease. To celebrate that life and highlight advances in information theory, the winner of the 2001 Shannon Award, Jack Wolf, organized a Shannon Symposium. Wolf is a professor at UC San Diego's Jacobs School of Engineering. The conference at the Center for Magnetic Recording Research on the UCSD campus featured presentations by 14 world-renowned thinkers and practitioners of information theory who came from as far away as the Netherlands. Conference goers included this graduate student who paid tribute in a way Shannon would have certainly appreciated.
Shannon was truly a Renaissance figure.
Do it. Just pull it straight off.
After the symposium, Jack Wolf also dedicated a casting of the statue originally commissioned by the IEEE Information Theory Society for Shannon's hometown, with dignitaries including Qualcomm CEO Irwin Jacobs, who studied under Shannon at MIT, in attendance.
It is wonderful to recognize the fantastic contribution that he did make to information theory, to communications, setting up everything that is now moving ahead at such a rapid pace.
With Qualcomm based in San Diego and UCSD's School of Engineering named after the Qualcomm founder and his wife, the school has built a center of excellence in information theory among faculty and students unrivaled anywhere in the world.
We have, within the last 10 years, hired the best and the brightest of the young Shannon information theorists in the U.S. This is the center of gravity of information theory in the United States at a university.
We feel very close to the work of Claude Shannon. I was chatting with Toby Berger, and we were talking a little bit about the communication theory and systems and coding group that's been put together here at UC San Diego. And he very kindly said, you know, for the last 3 or 4 years, if one of my students wants to go study in that field, I say San Diego is the place you should go.
At the symposium, former colleagues, students, friends, and admirers discussed Shannon's legacy.
There's always this historical question about if this person hadn't existed, would the world be really different? And people say, nah, it would always, someone else would have thought the same thing. But I don't believe that. I believe individual people make a big difference. And Shannon is one of the most supreme intellects of this century.
My guess is, you know, we're 10, 20 years ahead of where we would have been if Shannon hadn't been there to make these discoveries. There would have just been a lot of small discoveries, and he presented us with this big, clear picture all at once.
What he did for communications and information theory in general was startling and momentous, and if he hadn't come along, it would probably have taken us 30, 40 years to come up with probably only a subset of his invention.
The world would have gone ahead. We probably would have still had the internet today. We would have had high-speed modems and that kind of thing. We would have had error-correcting codes. But they might actually have been delayed. And there's almost nobody in the world you can say that about, that if that person hadn't existed, that the world wouldn't be quite like what it is today. But I truly believe Shannon is almost unique in that sense, that we wouldn't be as far along today if he hadn't lived and done what he did.